So Games Workshop just lifted the lid on a rather large rules reveal. Let's talk about how every faction is going to be able to build an army, what will be banned and what will be allowed in this new boarding actions game mode. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking once more about Games Workshop's upcoming expansion for Warhammer 40k, the indoor boarding actions expansion for playing small games set aboard a Space Hulk or Starship. They teased us with a few rules as to how terrain and combat interactions might work last time, but this time they've given us a really quite meaty update, some pretty specific rules as to how you're going to be able to build armies in the game, and then a rather large and detailed document saying exactly how every single special army is going to be able to field its units, with some rules changes to some common selections and various combinations that you can fill the units in. So as mentioned, this is all talking about the boarding actions game mode, the game mode that's going to be coming out in that Arks of Omen Abaddon book, and then fleshed out in future expansions after that. Today we've basically got three main bits to the reveal: this boarding patrol detachment that you can take, some general restrictions as to what you can and can't bring in a boarding actions army, then a big document of faction specific rules which goes into far more detail and actually removes a bunch of other rules from the game that are specific to each army but don't necessarily come up everywhere. First up, the way that you're going to be able to pick armies is going to be small games of around about 500 points worth of models. It feels like this is going to be a halfway house between Warhammer 40k and Kill Team in some ways. Model rules that are just a little bit more granular, with things like individual miniatures being able to block line of sight or being cover with halfway round a corner or something, but not every single model operating independently as with Kill Team. There's still going to be a few squads on the board. The way that you can select your army is with this boarding patrol detachment, which is actually a little bit more restrictive than I thought it might have been. In the army, you can literally only take 0 to 1 HQ choices, 0 to 3 troops, and 0 to 3 elites. In general, you're not allowed to bring fast attack or heavy support, though quite a lot of armies do have exemptions for certain specific units. A few interesting things about this one is that there's 0 compulsory slots, you don't have to bring any troops if you don't want to, and you don't even need to bring an HQ either if you don't want to. Though I guess if they start adding things like warlord traits and things, then you might well want to. Another rule that they sort of half discussed in the preview is that you're going to be able to have a boarding squads option. This sounds like certain units within the roster are going to be able to basically split in half in a similar sort of way to Space Marine combat squads. So rather than having a big unit of 10, you'd be able to split them into 2 smaller units of 5. How restrictive or unrestricted that's going to be, though, is kind of yet to be determined. As mentioned, a few armies get some specific exemptions to be able to take things from the fast attack or heavy support choices. Space Marines, for example, can take Hellblasters or Eradicators, whereas Demons can take Fleshhounds. How restrictive or unrestricted this is, though, really just vary from army to army. In general, though, it does have the effect of locking out some of the very fastest movers in the book, and also some of the heaviest firepower. Apparently future Arks of Omens books beyond the Abaddon one will change up the options that you're allowed to take in this somehow. Maybe there might be options for bigger games, more HQs, or allowing you a few more options out of fast attacks or heavies. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. Otherwise though, even within those slots, there's really quite a lot of restrictions that you have to fulfill on top of that. There's a bunch of broad rules that prohibit most things from the game, though aren't universal, and a lot of faction special rules do exempt them. In general though, there's no vehicles and no monsters in the game, and you can't take any bikes or cavalry. And yes, just in case you were wondering, indeed you can't play Imperial or Chaos Knights in this game mode, though I guess that was kind of obvious from the start. A few bikes and cavalry keyword things do look like they can be fielded though, say for example Tau Crutox and the Adeptus Mechanicus Cataphren Servitors, which technically have the bike keyword. Otherwise, generally you can't take any jump pack or fly keyword units unless your army's got a specific exemption, say for example Crisis Suits can be fielded for Tau, but when those exemptions exist, you can't actually use their fly ability, so you can't be ignoring terrain with that. In general as well, you're usually only allowed to take one character model along, though some armies can certainly take a few more with specific exemptions like the Sisters of Battle. It does seem that Games Workshop really have taken a fairly heavy hand to try and tailor each faction's rules individually. On top of that, as they've already confirmed, you are going to be cutting out a whole chunk of options within each codex. You can't use any codex-specific stratagems, relics, or warlord traits. Cutting out stratagems in particular will really affect how certain units play. You can't just be popping into extra defense with Primaris Marines with transhuman physiology, and you can't make big squads of Necrons teleport across the board with things like the Veil of Darkness. Supposedly the only stratagems that you're going to be able to use are the Command Point Reroll one, the Combat Interrupt type one, and Insane Bravery, with future Arks of Omen books adding in options on all 3 fronts, tailored for each faction. It will break a lot of combos, and might just mean the optimal choice isn't particularly obvious for some factions perhaps. Then beyond all those restrictions, we've got all the faction-specific rules, which is a rather meaty section that's got a whole bunch of common themes, but you do get individual tailored things from one army to another. First up, as with restrictions on Warhammer 40k match play, there is a requirement to take all your forces from say the same chapter, legion, or equivalent for your army, so no having weird combos with say multiple different craft worlds within a force, or various things like that. Psychic powers are one of the entries in the codex that has stayed into this mini-game, but with that, Games Workshop actually handed out really quite a lot of nerfs. Various different psychic powers cost more warp charge points for certain abilities. Say for example, certain witchfires cost a little bit more to cast with a higher warp charge cost. In particular, teleportation abilities like Da Jump or the Thousand Suns Cult of Duplicity one, they're just ridiculously costly at 10 or 11 warp charge, so likely aren't going to be very good viable options. And it's kind of similar with double move type options like warp time. Otherwise, they seem to have reprinted a few of the balanced data slate updates. I'm not 100% sure whether or not the other balanced data slate changes would apply to this or not. Might be something that they clarify elsewhere. As mentioned, most models that have it lose the fly keyword if they can be taken, and you lose any outflank style abilities to turn up on the edge of the board, which I guess makes less sense in an enclosed environment. Certain army-wide traits are altered as well, say for example Raven Guard and Alpha Legion type traits where they get some extra cover and things at longer ranges. Those ranges are now generally set to 6 inches, otherwise they'd be kind of useless in the boarding actions game. And there's a few other changes to armies that have things like scout moves on the go, where you get a free move after deployment, or certain armies that get objectives secured across their whole army like Necrons. They generally count as counting as double of the models for objectives. A big section of the rules though are for individual unit changes. Certain units can only take a certain amount of models in them, some of them can only take set amounts of models, some units can be taken even though they're not troops or elites, basically things that tend to be small squads that you might expect to be operating within a boarding actions type of move, and a few armies need things like certain lore appropriate characters to unlock certain choices within their roster, or to unlock some army-wide special rules. Those are the broad themes, but let's take a look at each faction in turn and what sort of things Games Workshop has got for them. So first up, we've got the Space Marines, and these do appear to cover the divergent chapters like Space Wolves and Blood Angels and things as well. Kind of hilariously, it says that you can include one Lord of War unit, but only if it's a Primarch unit, kind of implying that you can include Guilliman if you want to in this list, even though he does have the monster keyword at the moment. I guess he must have some other exception to the monster rule, as he's technically got a monster keyword right now. It's not impossible that Games Workshop might be updating his rules at some stage, though. There were rumoured to be new content for the Ultramarines and Friends coming out in the not too distant future. As well as that, the Marines can take a few fast attack choices, including an assault squad that doesn't have jump packs, or a unit of Fenrisian Wolves. And in the heavy support section, you can take things like Hellblasters and Eradicators, but you can't use things like Devastators or Eliminators. Feels maybe a bit arbitrary which units they've decided to include or not include. I guess they've just chosen a few select units that they think would fit in with the boarding actions theme. Perhaps things that you might expect to have storming a ship with some close range firepower. Some of the units have restrictions on, things like the Fenrisian Wolves having a starting strength of 5, same with the Hellblasters, though no restrictions on the Eradicators apparently. And there's a couple of restrictions for units that you can only take with certain characters. Company veterans must have a captain, and servitors must have a tech marine. Otherwise, they've said that the combat squads rule doesn't apply, instead they get split by the boarding squads rule, which does sound like it's going to be somewhat similar. If you Raven Guard, then you get your cover at 6 inches rather than the normal greater than 12 or 18 inches, and a couple of other clarifications like Fenrisian Wolves can't perform actions like open doors and things, and models with the outflank ability lose it for the purpose of the battle. Considering just how many codex supplements this covers, it's actually maybe a slightly surprisingly small list of exceptions. Space Marines perhaps are particularly well covered for choices in the elite section, with a whole bunch of elite infantry like Terminators and Stern Guard veterans and things slugging their way towards the enemy. For the Sisters of Battle, their army construction rules are a bit more freeing than some things. You can take 3 character models, compared with a normal 1 that you can select, but only one of those can have a wounds characteristic of 5 or more, so you can't be doubling up on things like Canonesses. You can take both Ephrael Stern and Kaiganil, however, despite the fact that they break that rule. Otherwise, weirdly enough, they seem to restrict Sisters Repentia to either being fielded in units of 4 or units of 9, and if you're in a unit of 9, then you've got to split it down into a squad of 4 and of 5, probably due to that boarding squads rule. Maybe they just feel that one big powerful unit with that many models in it might be a bit too much, I don't know. Otherwise, Arco-Flagellants again are pretty restricted, only squads of 3, 5 or 10, Not sure why they specifically go for those compared with other units. It doesn't say it looked like Celestian Sacrosants, for example, have any sort of similar restrictions. Beyond that, you can take a Dominion squad, though it doesn't look like you can take things like Seraphim or Zephyrim. They're not allowed to play even if they're just walking, and it doesn't look like there's any option to take Retributors. Kind of a shame on that one, as I feel like a unit of those burning out the enemy with heavy flamers would be appropriate enough. On top of that, you can't use the Triumph of St. Catherine. I guess that makes sense, despite being infantry it is a ridiculously enormous model, it's not going to fit in most corridors, and you also can't take the Rapturous Blows Blessing of the Faithful for some reason. Games Workshop do seem to have restricted a few of the best combat options from this game mode. I'm not entirely sure why though. I feel like, say for that one, even if you put that on a fighty Canoness or something, it maybe still isn't going to match up to the might that a Space Marine Captain or something could achieve with just his war gear and upgrades. Obviously, it's a bit hard to say what exactly is going to be good for each army, seeing as we don't know the full game mode rules. Generally speaking, though, big armoured things slogging towards the enemy probably make a lot of sense to be decent. I wouldn't be too surprised if, say, the Sacrosants might be a reasonable choice for the Sisters, holding down those corridors with their tough shields. For Adeptus Custodes, you can take some Witch Seekers Sisters of Silence if you want to as a fast attack slot, just one unit of those. If you take Wardens and you take them in a squad of 6, then you must split them into 2 squads. And if you take the Alaric Custodian Terminators, then you can only take them in squads of 1, 2, or 3, and you have to split them all into individual model squads, which you can fill them in anyway if you want to. You can only take the Knight Centura if you've got at least one other Anathema Psychana unit, maybe just a little bit of lore there, meaning that they've actually got some sisters to lead. And again, there's another restricted melee upgrade. You can't take Unstoppable Destroyer as the Captain Commander ability, allowing you to ping in and out of combat potentially. There's also a rules adaptation for the Sisters of Silence as well, in that their Daughters of the Abyss special rule where they make enemy psychic tests work. That only applies if they can actually see the enemy model trying to take the psychic test. There's quite a lot of restriction of rules basically not going round corners and through walls to potentially affect squads on the other side of walls that potentially can't interact. Adeptus Mechanicus next, and they're slightly restricted on the amount of servitors that you can take. You can only include one and no more than one unit of breachers, and the same for destroyers. I don't know whether that boarding squads rule might mean that you can split them down into smaller units if you do take a big one. It does look like the other force organisation slots, things like the Cerberus and the Taraxi, they're both out due to being fast attack and being cavalry and fly. You can only use servitors in the detachment if you contain at least one tech priest. You can't include Cybernetica Datasmiths, as I guess it doesn't make sense to without the Castellan robots, and a few of their special rules are locked to only if you have a single HQ choice. Say for example, Doctrina Imperatives only apply if you've got a Skitari Marshal, the Canticles only apply if your Warlord's a Tech Priest or has the Master of the Forge dogma. And again, there's one of those stealthy army clarifications that applies to the Styges 8 Forge World, which means that they only get cover if they're greater than 6 inches away from their targets. I'd guess that perhaps the big chunky breachers might be interesting enough in a close environment situation, fairly big and chunky, though I guess things like Electro Priests could be interesting enough as well. Grey Knight special things are that you can field an Interceptor squad. They can do so even though they're fast attack, though their rules are slightly altered, only having a movement characteristic of 6, and their teleport packs basically allow them a once per game teleport move, in which they can move through enemy models and terrain, potentially warping to the other side of a wall, I suppose. I'd guess that could be really quite important if it allows them to strike the enemy from a completely unexpected angle. Movement lanes and things look like they'd be really restricted in this game mode. Otherwise, a similar restriction for servitors, you can only take them if you've got a Brotherhood Tech Marine. Wisdoms of the Prognosticars are completely banned, so none of those interesting once per game abilities in the army on your characters. They changed the Tide of Shadows to be the usual 6 inch away restriction, meaning that you'll be able to get the light cover but fairly close. And then perhaps the most interesting thing for Grey Knights is they've messed around with the psychic powers a fair bit. You can't do any witch fires from the Sanctic discipline or the Brotherhood powers more than once per battle round, and have quite heavily restricted the Gate of Infinity psychic power, meaning that you need an 11 plus to cast it, so you're not going to be teleporting your units around very easily at all, and it's not going to be something to be relied on. Similar for Vortex of Doom as well. They feel like they don't want those close quarter witch fires splashing mortal wounds all over the place. That one's got a warp charge of 10. Again, it's going to be a bit of a gamble if you want to try and cast that. It is kind of interesting to see what sort of things they've touched and left alone. Quite a lot of psychic powers do seem to be altered in other factions as well, particularly ones that allow teleporting or big area of effect witchfires. Moving on to the Guard next, and they're also allowed a few more support characters. You can only have one that's got a wound characteristic of 5 or more, but you can have 2 others on top of that if you want. I guess similar to the Sisters of Battle, they've got a fair few more minor characters, so you might be able to conceivably field a bunch in a small point game. Otherwise, they've got some specific rules for the command squad. You can take an attaché, but only one in the unit, and then if you're doing boarding squads, then you don't split the command squad unit into more than one unit, and it's the same business for any infantry squads as well. They just keep as a 10-man squad. It does seem to be similar for a few other horde units within the game. Otherwise, they changed the recon operator's doctrine to a pre-game move that allows you to make a normal move outside of your entry zone. I guess that's equivalent of the deployment zone in this mission. Psychic Maelstrom is a little bit more hard to cast, casting on an 8 rather than a 6, so it's not huge to be honest, and models with the aerial drop ability lose that ability for the battle. I guess that makes sense with Scions dropping into the fight. It is interesting that they seem to make the difference between, say, aerial drop type special rules or teleportation special rules. There don't appear to be any restrictions on things like Terminators teleporting into battle, but if in the lore you're dropping down from the skies, say with aerial drop or a Manta Strike or something, then that's not allowed. Otherwise, again, looks like there's no heavy weapon teams allowed in this. Again, I suppose their bases might struggle a little bit to navigate through the narrow corridors. Moving on for the Imperium, and there's an Agents of the Imperium section. Unlike regular 40k, where you might struggle to field these as a whole army, it does look like in 500-point games like this, they might actually be playable. And I feel like that's really quite a cool narrative thing. I'm sure a few people enjoy fielding an Inquisitorial Strike Force or something as a boarding force. As they aren't really a standalone faction with their own codex, the rules are a bit more complex perhaps. If you include an Inquisitor model, you can include up to 3 Inquisition character models, things like the Drukhari or the Demon Host I guess, and they changed the Acolyte's battlefield role to be troops, and you have to take them in a squad size of 5. You're also allowed to include one Officio Assassinorum model, regardless of how many character models that you have, and you get to pick one of your Imperial agents to kind of be your primary faction. You either get to select Acolyte units, Navis Imperialis troops units, or the Adeptus Arbites troops units, and these all gain objectives secured. As mentioned in the previous video, the mention of Adeptus Arbites is kind of interesting here. They don't have any models out at the moment, and this does help confirm that they are going to be getting a kill team release at some point soon. Beyond that, there's a whole host of other clarifications. When you're forming boarding squads, Voidsmen at Arms don't split. I guess they're only in 6 model units anyway. Demon Hosts lose demonic power and just add 1 to their strength and attacks characteristics instead. When you deploy an Inquisition unit, you can also put a Jokero Weaponsmith in the same entry zone as well. That kind of implies that each entry zone has to just have 1 unit in normally, I suppose. If the boarding party doesn't contain any characters but does include Exaction squad units, then you can give the Proctor Exactant model a upgrade as if it were a character model, some sort of enhancement, probably a warlord trait and relic as per later books in the Arcs of Omen series. The Exaction squad is new, and I strongly suspect that will be the entry for the Adeptus Arbites. Kind of cool that it sounds like you'd be able to field them as a standalone army potentially. The Assassins, the Jokero, and the Demon Host models can never be given enhancements. I guess that means they're not going to be leading your force with like warlord traits and relics and things. And it sounds like Assassins get to deploy just a little bit further forward. Rather than having their usual ability to spring up from nowhere, you get to spring them up somewhere within 6 inches of an entry zone on the first turn that you set up, so they can't just turn up right in the middle of the enemy forces and tear a squad apart with an Eversaur or something. Overall, I feel like this is perhaps one of the most fun parts of the entire document. Kind of interesting to have the idea of putting together a disparate force of Imperial agents. A lot of the datasheets aren't particularly strong or anything, but it sounds like it could make a really good narrative force. First up, and for the Chaos Marines, the Alpha Legion gets their cover trait if they're greater than 6 inches away, and again they mess around with some psychic power casting values. Warp Time must be cast on a 9 for the double move, and the possession psychic power gives you a warp charge value of 8. Really don't know why they felt the need to restrict that one. That's one that basically is a targeted witchfire that deals some mortal wounds to a unit. Maybe it might be because it's, say, a focused witchfire potentially, something that can target models even though they're not the closest. Otherwise, Chaos Marine forces can also include a Chaos Spawn unit in the fast attack selection despite not being able to do so normally. You can include an extra HQ unit provided that extra HQ is a Dark Commune unit, even though they're not typically all that great. They are quite fun models, I guess. You can field a few more cultists than you can in normal games. You can include 2 cultist units for every Traitoris Astartes core infantry unit, rather than 1 as per normal games of 40k. You aren't allowed to spam Balefire Tomes, you can only take the 1 out of your force in a Chaos Legionary unit. Possessed can only be fielded in squads of 5 models, and you can't add more than that. Cultist mobs form one big Horde type unit, and you don't split them into boarding squads. And Accursed Cultists, weirdly enough, you must split into boarding squads, splitting out the Mutants and the Torments into 2 little mini units. There do seem to be quite a lot of specific things with the boarding squads. I guess Games Workshop are trying to quite carefully control how many units you can have in one squad. Just from reading these restrictions, it does sound like quite a lot of these boarding squad units must split into smaller units, potentially if you've got 6 or more models in a squad, I would guess. Again, some somewhat restrictive unit restrictions here. Looks like Obliterators and Havocs aren't going to be a thing in this one. Nor could you have Raptors or Warp Talons, but just tell them to walk. Next up, we've got the Death Guard. They've got a character exemption in that you can take a Feat of Virion character alongside a regular one if you want to. Again, they can field a fast attack spawn unit, and weirdly enough, they actually give you a small bonus to your spawn unit, basically allowing them to get the extra Nurgle stratagem for free, giving them the toughness 6 and disgustingly resilient. I guess that's kind of fun, seeing as that's a stratagem that you'd normally not be able to use in this game mode as they're all restricted. I guess sound like Spawn on paper could be extra powerful in Death Guard if they're getting a benefit that they usually wouldn't be able to get for free. It's a bit weird that their restrictions are kind of different to the Chaos Marines on this one. Rather than the Chaos Space Marines who can go fairly cultist heavy, these guys can't include more than 1 unit of cultists at all, and the combined total number of cultist and poxwalker units can't exceed the number of Plague Marine units. Really weird that basically the Death Guard can't spam their little guys, but the Chaos Space Marines can in abundance. Again, for some reason, some of the deadly pathogens are restricted. Unstable Sickness and Viscous Death are both banned. I really don't know why for those ones. Those are some okay attack upgrades, but aren't particularly exciting in my point of view. Maybe they're just trying to get rid of anything that effectively works like a warlord trait or relic to make your commander a bit more fighty. Finally, they also say when you're forming boarding squads, don't split cultists or poxwalkers into separate units. Again, I suppose they're going to be hoarding it up. Thousand Suns next, and their boarding patrol again says that you can include a single fast attack unit as Chaos Spawn, and again they get their faction specific benefit automatically included. You get that stratagem effectively in effect all the time, where they get to choose their favourite form of mutation. Again, the focus is firmly on the Cult Marines on this one. Your combined number of Cultist and Bray units can't exceed the number of Rubik Marines units, so that means that you're not going to be taking too many of those. The Legion command abilities are all banned, so you can't take Rahati for extra psychic casts, for example. And also limiting the number of psychic casts a little bit. If you've got Rubik Marines or Scarab units that split into 2 boarding squads, only the one with the Aspiring Sorcerer actually gets the Psychic keyword and the ability to cast. I guess it makes sense that the regular Rubric A would not. On top of that, the Malevolent Charge Cabalistic Ritual that gives you a little bit of extra mortal wounds now costs 5 Cabal points. Again, that's going to restrict the sheer amount of mortal wounds that you can spam out. Games Workshop do seem to be wanting to restrict Witchfires as much as possible in this. Warp Reality only counts open hatchways as terrain features for that power, and then a whole bunch of psychic powers have to be cast on really high casting values. Sorcerer's Facade on Warp Charge 11, that's the teleporting one for the Cult of Duplicity, I believe. Baleful Devolution and Dark Blessing are both on a 9, and Temporal Surge for the double move is cast on a 9 as well. I really feel that from all these changes, it feels like Games Workshop thought their game mode might well just be dominated by psychic powers and mortal wounds. Maybe that was some of the feedback that they had in playtesting, and then they decided to make all these changes as a result. Chaos Demons next, and again they get to take a unit outside of the normal Force Organization slot, with the option for Fleshhounds being included despite being fast attack, and can also take Flamers and Exalted Flamers, though they lose the Fly keyword. It sounds like the other lesser demons will all be split into boarding squads, probably of 5 models I suppose, though Blue Horrors are an exception to that, again I suppose a bit more little hoardy models. Otherwise, any models lose the Fly keyword if they have it. Horror models are allowed to take a boarding squad size above its standard size. A bunch of the Warp Storm points are slightly altered. Kind of interesting that the Warp Storm is in effect anyway in a Space Hulk, I suppose. You can't use the one to stop enemy reserves coming in quite as easily, and the ones that cause some damage on the enemy with some mortal wounds, they cost a few more Warp Storm points as well, probably meaning that you wouldn't want to use them, as in general they weren't that strong anyway. The Descending Shadow Warp Storm point is the one that gives you dense cover at a certain distance. In this game mode it becomes greater than 6 inches due to the confined corridors, and again a couple of psychic powers have changed a bit. Bolt of Change goes up to Warp Charge 9, and Infernal Gateway goes up to Warp Charge 10. That's the enormous splash damage one that could really wreak havoc in enclosed environments, I suppose. I'd guess the demons might not do too badly in this game mode. Feels like it could be quite helpful to be splitting things like Demonettes or Bloodletters down into individual squads. They might be a bit more useful if they're a bit more multiple small unit, perhaps. Moving on, we've got Craftworlds and Ynnari. One of their unit changes is that they can take Dark Reapers as a heavy support slot. Kind of interesting, seeing as they're basically long-range fire support units, and basically the other factions' equivalents like Devastators or Retributors seem not to be a thing. Apparently Storm Guardian or Guardian Defender units can include a Serpent Scale or heavy weapon platform as normal, even though it would mean that the unit had a starting strength of 11. I guess from that one we could kind of infer that you might not be able to field units of greater than 10 in this game normally, as that one has to be made a special rule for. I guess that kind of makes sense. I feel like units of 10 in themselves are probably going to be fairly clunky in this game mode in narrow corridors, never mind if you're trying to hoard it up even more than that. Warlocks can be taken in a squad size between 1 and 5, and again they say they break another rule that we don't know about yet, some sort of rule requiring such a unit to be taken at its minimum size. Maybe that's for character units or something. You can only upgrade one Aspect Warrior unit to have an Exarch power, so they're going to be a touch limited, so you'd have to pick and choose there. Models with the Favour of Cain ability can't be given enhancements. I believe that those ones are the Phoenix Lords, so no Warlord traits or things for them. You can't take the Hunters of Ancient Relics Craftworld attribute. That one's to have a unit perform an action while shoot without it failing. Kind of interesting that that one's locked out for some reason. Maybe no opening hatches and firing at the same time. And the army can't include any Harlequins units. It sounds like Harlequins and Craftworlds are going to be completely separate for the purposes of boarding actions. Otherwise, battle focus is entirely gone from this as well. You can't move, shoot, move round corners. That will probably be kind of painful. I feel like that probably does reduce the utility of quite a lot of Eldar units though. It is generally factored into their cost in 40k the main game. Phoenix Lords can't perform an action to secure site. We don't know what that is yet, but maybe that's due to them not being able to lose a certain amount of wounds in a turn. Perhaps the two are a bit incompatible. They've got the various stealth rules, all applying out to 6 inches rather than their normal 12 inches or so. Boarding actions counts as a combat patrol game for the purposes of Strands of Fate and how many rolls you get on that table. And Banshee Masks have a special rule that mean that they cancel the enemy's set to defend, which looks like it is something that you can do as an action or something, perhaps to brace to receive enemy troops and give yourself either a buff in combat or potentially a buff to firing Overwatch, as it sounds like you can do as well. They also have the Executioner power limited to a casting value of 9, maybe a little bit more doable for certain Craftworld Psychers. Again, it's a focus witchfire that seems to come at a big premium in this game mode. It might be kind of interesting to see exactly which armies are good at this sort of thing. I feel like there's probably going to be some advantages to armies that can move very rapidly up the board like Eldar, though whether or not that's worth it over things that just take a lot of damage and can hit you back hard in return, that's a bit less clear at the moment. It looks like things like Warp Spiders are out for this game mode though. Kind of an odd decision seeing as the Grey Knight Interceptors could be taken, but a direct equivalent with a teleporting jump pack cannot. For the Drukhari, they've got a special exception to allow them to take beasts. You can take Clawed Fiends and Chimerae, but apparently not the Razor Wings. Though you can only include those two if you've got a Beastmaster around, and the Court of the Archon's restricted to just the one Layman, Medusae, Slith, and Urgul fielded in that combination. Your Archons and Succubi and things can't take the Lords of Chimera upgrades. They're the ones to upgrade the retinues to things like Cabalite Trueborn or Rax Acathists, and for some reason you can't use the Agile Hunter's Cult Obsession either. That's a Witch Cult one that gets you a bit more movement and a bonus against fly units, most of which won't be flying at all anyway in this game mode at all. It looks like there's some provision for the Archon in a unit becoming a real space raid. If you've got a Warriors, Witches and Rax unit, then he can still unlock the Raid Mastermind ability and be able to command them. Mandrakes lose Fade Away, so they can't just disappear from the board once more and reappear elsewhere. The Beast unit can't operate the hatchways and do actions and things, and there is some limitation to their speed as well. The speed of the Kill Obsession cannot allow an advanced roll to go above 6. Feels like the nerfs to Drukhari here are really trying to rein in their speed. Maybe they don't just want the Dark Elves just rushing objectives or rushing up to get in the way of enemy units and keeping them out of the game all time long. Finally, they say that models with the Acrobatic Display Obsession can't use that obsession to move through walls or closed hatchways, again in a similar sort of way to other units not ignoring terrain. For the Harlequins, their extra units that you can take are 2 HQ slots if you don't include a Solitaire model, and the pivotal roles are a little bit restricted. You can only take one in the army, and Solitaire models can't take any enhancements, so Warlord traits or relics, or take a pivotal role. I'd guess that's maybe to restrict them from getting the one where they move super ridiculously fast, but who knows. The Harlequin's panoply can't allow you to move through walls or hatches and things, kind of similar to other stuff. While on the battlefield the Solitaire can't blitz as well, I guess that'll restrict his movement quite a bit. And the Death Jester's Lord of Crystal Bones ability, if you've got it, causes enemy units to lose set to defend or set overwatch. Usually that one denies overwatch normally, so it sounds like that's just adapting it to the slightly different rules that this boarding actions game will have. Otherwise, there's a few different psychic power changes. Twilight Pathways for the double move is 8, Mirror of Minds for the focus Witchfire is 9, and Webway Dance for the Feel No Pain is 6. Maybe not quite as harsh nerfs as some of the other factions. I guess Harlequins often move quite quickly anyway though. For the Tyranids, their exemptions are that the Neurothrope, Zoanthrope and Venomthropes can all be taken even though they fly, though again they have the rule that if they've got the fly keyword, they basically lose the ability for the purposes of this game. Their numbers are restricted a bit as well. You can't include both Zoanthropes and Venomthropes, it's one or the other. You can only take one Lictor, and you can include a fast attack, but it has to be Ripper Swarms. Again, as Horde units, when you're forming boarding squads, Termagants and Hormagaunts don't separate into separate units, so I guess they're going to be squads of 10, no more, no less. The Tyranids get an exemption to the thing where you have to measure around terrain if they're using synaptic links. I guess that makes sense that even if they are separated by metal, things like psychic communication would still go through it, even if it does separate out more normal communication like people shouting at each other for the lesser races. Otherwise, there's a few more common clarifications. The pre-game move Endless Multitude ability means that it allows you to move outside your entry zone rather than deployment zone. Paroxysm is clarified to cancel set overwatch and set to defend, which the enemy models sound like they'll be able to do. And the high fleet upgrades that allow you to gain cover and things, they apply a greater than 6-inch range rather than the normal 12 or whatever. Maybe for notable units that you can't play in this, the Raveners might be kind of key. I can't help but think that those burrowing little nightmares would be kind of fun. Basically faster moving and harder hitting warriors. Genestealer Cult next, and again they get a bit of an exemption for characters. You can include 3 of them, but only one can have a wounds characteristic of 5 or higher like a Patriarch. Proficient planning is completely out for these guys, so none of those normal game-breaking tricks that they can often do for a points cost. You can't include Brood Brothers, and Neophyte Hybrids as a Horde infantry squad. They don't get separated out into separate units unlike most things. A few other changes is that when the Genestealer Cults summon the cult, you halve the number. Maybe not the most common upgrade ever, but I guess it could help. And Genestealer Cult units lose the Conceal rule and instead gets to set up their units after the enemy is set up, so I guess react better to how they've deployed. I can't help but think that at least on paper, Genestealer Cult might just be a bit underpowered in these sort of games. Often they do rely on their gamey setup shenanigans to get the jump on the enemy, and if that's not going to be the case, then I just feel like the raw power of their datasheets probably isn't going to be enough to carry them against most foes. Other clarifications are that you can't crossfire through walls, kind of makes sense, they basically count as being obscuring. The traits that allow you to gain cover at a certain range count as greater than 6 inches, and Mental Onslaught, the psychic power that allows you to deal some focused mortal wounds, that goes up to a warp charge of 7. Not the biggest change in the world, but might make it a bit less tempting. For the Space Dwarves of the Leagues of Votann, their main unit exemption is that you can take a unit of the Brokir Thunderkin, the great big guys with the heavy weapons. I guess they might be able to use their grav weapons a little bit more effectively at close range, though the beam weapons look like they'd be extra bad, having to not be able to fire at very long distances. You also can't upgrade a Brokir Iron Master to be a Brokir Forge Master as well. I guess the reason for that is that he's the one who discounts the wargear stratagems and things. If you're not going to have any wargear stratagems at the start, it might make sense not to. Though I suppose if they add in some more stratagems and things, then having access to discounted boarding action stratagems might actually be something that they don't intend. Otherwise, it looks like judgment tokens will be staying in this, though they might have a touch less effect if a lot of units are going to be separating out into very tiny little units, and apparently you can't hand them out for certain actions like setting to overwatch, defend, or operate hatchways, which I guess that 100% confirms that doing things like setting overwatch and setting to defend are actions, so I guess you will be able to tell your units to do that, and then potentially be able to get ready to fire when the enemy rounds corners, or get better attacks in melee or something. Otherwise, their comms array allows them to count as being within range of the friendly car models wherever they are on the battlefield. I suppose the battlefields on that are fairly small. And there's a small clarification for the Crushing Contempt psychic power. That one will cancel Overwatch or set to defend the actions that we just talked about. For the Necrons, they're allowed to take an extra HQ slot, provided one of them's a Cryptek. You get to include one fast attack slot, though it has to be either Scarab Swarms or Ophidian Destroyers. Kind of weird that the Ophidian Destroyers are allowed by this, but things like Wraiths aren't. I don't really see any massive reason why you couldn't have wraiths burrowing their way through a Space Hulk, to be honest. Maybe they thought that wraiths might not be a good idea being able to warp through walls, but I suppose they could have addressed that in a similar sort of way as all the FAQs turn off fly for the units that have them. Otherwise, you can only take Cryptothralls if you've got a Cryptek along. You can only take a Plasmacite along if you've got at least one Destroyer Cult unit, and there's a few banned items from the Cryptek Arcana section, things like the Atavandicator, Metalodermal Tesla Weave, and Quantum Orb. Otherwise, as with the rest of the armies, if you've got some fly models like some of the Crypteks, then they lose it. You can't use things like, I think it's the Nihilak translocation beams to warp through walls or things. That does very much seem to be a common game-wide thing. The army traits where you get the entire army to be OBSEC instead grant infantry models the ability to count as 2 models when determining objectives, so maybe a bit of a side grade there considering quite a lot of them will be infantry. And the other common pick within the custom traits, the Relentlessly Expansionist one, that gives you a 6-inch move outside of your entry zone rather than in the deployment zone. Plasmasites can set up in the same entry zone as the Destroyer units. Again, sounds like it might just be 1 per zone otherwise. And apparently Scorpec Lords aren't allowed to set up alongside other units in an entry zone. I don't know if that's because they're too big or too violent or a bit of both. Finally, Flayed Ones are allowed to get Lurking Horrors. Each time an attack is made against them, subtract 1 from the attack's hit roll. I must admit I'm really not sure why they're targeting Flayed Ones for a focused buff there. I kind of wonder if that means that that's in compensation for losing something. Perhaps they won't have any way of deep striking or something as per mission rules. I guess we'll wait and see on that front. Next up, we've got the Orks. Their detachment restrictions are that you can take a second character, but only if one of them's a Runt Herd, and you can only include 1 Gretchen unit. That one doesn't get split up into boarding squads. You can take a heavy support unit, but that's got to be Flash Gits. There don't seem to be any other fast attack or heavy support units allowed. You can only take 2 units of Meganobs. It seems like you can't have an entire army of Deathwing, for example. And only 1 model in the army can take a custom job, not that they usually tend to be particularly effective on the mechs. Otherwise, for the commandos, Throat Slitters only applies if the enemy is within 1 inch of an open hatchway. The Blood Axes only gain their cover outside of 6 inches, not the usual plus 18 inches. Lucky Blue Gits is sort of similar to the Necron one, counting as extra models on objectives rather than just giving all infantry OBSEC. The Tank Hammer is kind of hilarious in that even if the Tank Hammer misses the target, the bearer is destroyed and the unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. Gretchen and Runt Herds can share an entry zone apparently, and that jump is changed to a warp charge value of 11, again meaning that you're probably not going to be teleporting your Orks about the board. Finally, for the Xenos, we've got the Tau Empire. When mustering the army, they've got rather a lot of rules. You can take a hover drone on the Ethereal even though it has fly, and you can take stealth suits, farsight, and crisis suits even though they've got fly and jetpack keywords. Just again, they count as not having the fly keywords, and they get a move characteristic of 6 instead, slowly picking their way through the holds, I guess. In the fast attack slot, they can take Pathfinder teams and tactical drones, though your fire warrior units and things can't include things like tactical drones or support turrets and things. You can only include Kroot units if you've got at least 1 unit of Kroot carnivores. You can take a Krootok squad, and it's got to be up to 3 models. You can't upgrade anything to be prototype systems, and when you're forming boarding squads, don't split Kroot units into separate units. I guess they all stay together and are a bit more hoardy. It also looks like you can take Kroot hounds as well, but they're forbidden from doing actions like opening hatchways with their jaws. Finally, models with Manta Strike basically lose it. If they've got the stealth abilities that apply at certain ranges, it goes out to 6 inches again. And Commander Farsight gets an attack characteristic of 3 rather than his usual amount. I'm really not sure why they felt the need to nerf him in that way, to be honest. It's not like a bunch of the other factions can't include certain powerful character units. It seems like the Space Marines can even include Gilliman as a Primarch. I don't know if that in some way is something to do with the fact that he's getting a new model and potentially new rules. Just all seems a bit arbitrary. I must admit there's really quite a lot of legwork getting the Tau army functional in these boarding actions games. Loads of choices that you can arbitrarily include or not include or take certain amounts of. I have a feeling that a bunch of the crisis suits and things might just be a bit worse than normal. Losing a decent amount of movement and fly and things is probably going to hurt quite a bit. So anyway, there we have it, a whole host of faction-specific special rules there. Really quite a lot of stuff, and gives us a fair amount of idea as to how this new boarding actions expansion is going to be playing. Really quite a lot of rules there. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Given all those restrictions and things, would you be tempted to give your faction a try in the boarding actions expansion? Or do you feel like they're a bit too arbitrary or restrictive for you? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep any more news of the boarding actions expansion coming, and I will get round to a full review of the game mode once it's out. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's what allows me to keep all this 40k content coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair amount of advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.